In early 1917, the crushing weight of the First World War finally broke the Russian Empire. The 300-year Romanov dynasty collapsed in a matter of days, ending centuries of absolute autocratic rule. The Tsar's abdication left a massive power vacuum. A fragile provisional government tried to maintain order, but they immediately faced competition from rapidly growing grassroots worker and soldier councils, known in Russian as Soviets. In October, an uncompromising faction within these councils seized control. Led by Vladimir Lenin, the Bolsheviks captured the state apparatus by leveraging the popular egalitarian slogan, "All power to the Soviets." Lenin immediately declared the transition to a dictatorship of the proletariat. The stated goal was to dismantle the old capitalist order by nationalizing land, taking over the banks, and pulling Russia out of the war. But pulling down an empire and building a new society are two very different tasks. Almost overnight, this ideological takeover plunged an exhausted nation into a chaotic civil war. The Bolsheviks traded their utopian dreams for brutal survival tactics. Between 1918 and 1921, the country was torn apart by the Russian Civil War. The newly formed Bolshevik Red Army fought a fragmented coalition of conservative forces, monarchists, and foreign-backed invaders known as the White Armies. To keep their armies fed and their factories running, the Bolsheviks instituted a hyper-centralized economic policy called war communism. The state nationalized all industry and deployed armed detachments to forcibly requisite grain from the peasantry. The human cost of this policy was catastrophic. Between combat, epidemics of typhus, and a famine triggered by the forced grain seizures, an estimated 10 million people died. Despite the collapse of the civilian economy, Leon Trotsky organized and commanded the Red Army, enforcing strict military discipline to secure an ultimate victory on the battlefield. The Bolsheviks had survived, but military victory came at the cost of their original vision. Instead of a thriving socialist society, they now controlled a nation of empty factories and depopulated cities. By early 1921, the physical endurance of the population was at a breaking point. Massive peasant rebellions and a severe mutiny by the previously loyal Kronstadt sailors threatened to topple the Bolshevik government from within. Realizing the state was on the verge of collapse, Lenin executed a sudden pragmatic pivot. At the 10th Party Congress, he announced the New Economic Policy, or NEP. The NEP was a direct ideological retreat. It allowed a return to small-scale private enterprise and permitted peasants to sell their surplus grain on open markets. This hybrid of state-run capitalism restored the nation's food supply and stabilized the economy. But while Lenin loosened his grip on the economy, he tightened his grip on politics. To prevent the party from splintering during this crisis, the 10th Congress enacted a strict ban on all internal party factions. This decision permanently ended internal dissent in favor of regime survival. It created the legal framework that future leaders would use to enforce absolute party discipline. With the Civil War ending, the Bolsheviks faced a geographic challenge: how to formally integrate the conquered territories, like Ukraine, Belarus, and Transcaucasia, with Soviet Russia. Joseph Stalin, serving as the Commissar for Nationalities, proposed a plan called autonomization. He wanted these regions to be absorbed directly into the Russian Republic, creating a single Russia-dominated centralized state. From his sickbed, Lenin fiercely opposed Stalin's plan. He denounced the heavy-handed absorption as Great Russian Chauvinism, fearing it would alienate the non-Russian populations they had just brought under their control. Instead, Lenin proposed an egalitarian federal union. In his model, the Russian Republic would enter as a partner of equal rank alongside the other republics in a brand new supranational entity. This internal clash exposed the contradiction at the heart of the Soviet experiment, balancing Marxist theory with the reality of an empire. A compromise was finally reached. On December 30, 1922, delegates gathered in Moscow to sign the Declaration and Treaty of Union. This treaty created the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. 4 founding republics merged into a single entity, appearing to fulfill Lenin's vision of an equal federation. Theoretically, each could freely secede. In practice, absolute authority over the military, trade, and economy was centralized in Moscow. But the architect of this balance would not live to manage it. After a series of debilitating strokes, Vladimir Lenin died in January 1924, creating a power vacuum at the top of the party. The USSR's legal creation coincided with its ideological founder's loss. Lenin left behind a centralized state machinery, now vulnerable to capture. Joseph Stalin recognized exactly how to capture it. Using his administrative role as general secretary, Stalin began quiet, strategic maneuvering, exploiting the 1921 ban on factions to silence potential opposition. Stalin utilized the nomenklatura, the party's personnel system. Dictating appointments from the top down, he filled the government with loyalists, isolating rivals like Trotsky. The 1924 Constitution codified this, fusing the Communist Party bureaucracy with the state apparatus, making separation impossible. By the time Lenin was placed in his mausoleum, the reality of the new Soviet Union was set.
The idealistic workers' revolution of 1917 had been replaced by a rigid command state. By 1924, the state had transformed. The revolution became a rigid bureaucratic system, organized by Lenin's survival tactics and consolidated under Stalin's administrative control.
In the late 1920s, the Soviet Union was a massive, overwhelmingly agrarian nation. It was a country of wooden plows and dirt roads, surrounded by heavily armed, industrialized neighbors that viewed the communist experiment with intense hostility. Joseph Stalin had consolidated absolute power over this vulnerable state. He calculated that without rapid, heavy industrialization, the Soviet Union would be crushed. He demanded the country close a 100-year economic gap in a single decade. To execute this timeline, the state relied on Gosplan, the Central Planning Committee. Gosplan's mandate was to draft the exact architectural blueprint required to turn a peasant society into an industrial superpower overnight. This diagram illustrates Gosplan's core mechanism, material balances. Planners completely discarded the concept of money. Instead, they measured the entire national economy in raw physical units. They balanced tons of steel, timber, and coal against the quotas of new factories. But the math did not add up. To build the plants, the state needed industrial capital that did not exist. There was a massive deficit in the physical ledger. To balance the equation, Stalin determined the raw capital would be extracted directly from the blood and labor of the Soviet peasantry. The state launched a campaign of forced collectivization. Private farms were seized and consolidated into massive, state-controlled agricultural enterprises. The goal was to maximize grain extraction to feed the new industrial cities and to sell abroad. When wealthier peasants, known as kulaks, resisted giving up their property, they were reclassified as class enemies. The state dispatched armed brigades to liquidate them, leading to mass arrests and the deportation of millions of rural families to remote settlements. The disruption of collectivization caused agricultural production to plummet. Yet, to pay for imported Western machinery, Gosplan maintained its relentless export quotas, shipping grain out of the country while the people who grew it had nothing to eat. The direct result was a man-made famine spanning from 1932 to 1933. In regions like Ukraine, where the starvation is known as the Holodomor, state requisitions stripped villages bare. While the countryside starved, the state's industrial output exploded. In a matter of years, entire complexes like Magnetorsk were erected from the bare steppe, churning out the steel demanded by the 5-year plans. Between 5 and 7 million people died of starvation during this period. Their deaths were the physical price paid to balance Gosplan's ledgers and achieve the state's industrial blitz. Human beings naturally resist a system that treats them as expendable inputs. To maintain absolute compliance and protect his economic engine, Stalin constructed a vast security apparatus that institutionalized terror. During the Great Purge of the late 1930s, the secret police targeted anyone deemed a potential threat. Old revolutionaries, factory managers, and the military high command were subjected to show trials, forced to confess to fabricated conspiracies, and executed. Hundreds of thousands were shot, and millions more were funneled into the Gulag. This sprawling network of forced labor camps swelled to hold 5 million prisoners at its peak, extracting timber, gold, and coal from the most hostile environments in the Soviet Union. The terror extended beyond the accused. Under Operational Order No. 00486, the secret police routinely arrested the wives of alleged traitors. Women were sentenced to years of hard labor, simply by marital association. When mothers were taken, their children were seized by the state and placed in isolated orphanages. There, they were stripped of their family identities and educated to be perfectly compliant subjects of the Soviet system. The purges and the gulags served a dual purpose. They eliminated political dissent, but they also provided a massive, disposable slave labor force to subsidize the extreme physical costs of Gosplan's industrial quotas. In June 1941, Nazi Germany launched Operation Barbarossa. German armor pierced deep into Soviet territory, threatening total collapse. To protect their industrial base, Soviet leadership ordered a massive evacuation. Entire factories were dismantled and moved thousands of miles eastward, behind the Ural Mountains. The relocation was grueling. Workers in freezing temperatures frantically reassembled heavy machinery in open fields, working around the clock to restart the nation's industrial heartbeat. The Great Patriotic War brought unimaginable civilian suffering. Major population centers were reduced to rubble. Millions of citizens endured starvation and bombardment during the sieges of cities like Leningrad and Stalingrad. But the evacuated factories held. The sheer volume of steel and machinery pouring out of the Urals fueled the Red Army. It sustained armored meat grinders like the Battle of Kursk, eventually breaking the German advance with overwhelming mechanized output. The survival of the state rested on a bitter irony. The same ruthless, inhumane industrial machine that terrorized the population in the 1930s produced the weapons to save them from annihilation in the 1940s. The Soviet counteroffensive pushed the German army back across Europe. The campaign culminated in May 1945, with the Red Army storming Berlin and raising their flag over the devastated German capital. The mathematical tally of this victory was staggering. At least 27 million Soviet citizens were dead. An entire generation had been wiped from the earth to repel the invasion. The Soviet Union emerged from the war's wreckage as a heavily militarized, globally feared superpower. This immense geopolitical strength stood in stark contrast to the physical reality of the population. The millions of soldiers, laborers, and prisoners who survived the ordeal were exhausted and severely traumatized. Gosplan's brutal equation was finally balanced, and the Stalinist fortress was secure. But because its industrial foundations were cemented in the bones of its own people, it birthed a deeply paranoid, fiercely guarded empire, setting the stage for the Cold War. In March 1953, the architect of the Soviet state died. For decades, Joseph Stalin had ruled through a system of absolute personalized terror. Scramble for succession, Nikita Khrushchev maneuvered his way to the top. To secure his position and move the country forward, he recognized he had to dismantle the apparatus of terror that kept the party paralyzed. In February 1956, he delivered a closed-door address to the 20th Party Congress that came to be known as the Secret Speech. In it, Khrushchev methodically outlined Stalin's crimes against the party, shattering the myth of the dead dictator's infallibility. The physical effects of this admission were immediate. The state began dismantling the massive gulag system, releasing hundreds of thousands of prisoners. A period of cultural liberalization known as the Thaw began, allowing writers and artists to explore previously forbidden themes. For a society that had been frozen in rigid ideological conformity, the sudden permission to breathe and speak freely was a visceral shock. But attempting to reform a system built entirely on state terror creates an existential problem. If the state admits its supreme leader was a murderous tyrant, it loses the absolute moral authority required to command blind obedience. That crisis of authority quickly spilled across Soviet borders. In Eastern Europe, satellite states interpreted Khrushchev's domestic thaw as an opportunity. In the autumn of 1956, Hungary rose in open revolt, seeking independence from Moscow's orbit. The Soviet response demonstrated the hard boundaries of reform. The Red Army was sent in to ruthlessly crush the uprising, securing the bloc at the cost of thousands of lives. This established the defining paradox of the era.
The Soviet Union was desperately trying to liberalize its ideological soul at home, while relying on brute military force to hold its empire together abroad. Despite these internal contradictions, the Khrushchev era successfully projected an image of absolute technological invincibility on the global stage. The launch of Sputnik 1 in 1957 provided the world with undeniable proof that the Soviet command economy could mobilize its resources to leapfrog the West. 4 years later, Yuri Gagarin's orbital flight cemented this optical victory. The Soviet Union was undeniably a global superpower, leading the charge into space. Projecting this dominance required intense effort. To maintain the appearance of supremacy, Khrushchev engaged in increasingly dangerous foreign policy gambles. This brinksmanship peaked in the fall of 1962, when Soviet nuclear missiles were secretly deployed to Cuba. Bringing the world to the edge of nuclear war terrified the West, but it was equally alarming to Khrushchev's own Politburo. Maintaining the superpower illusion required a chaotic, high-stakes gambling style that the traumatized Soviet political elite simply could no longer tolerate. In October 1964, the bureaucratic elite, the nomenklatura, organized an internal coup. They voted to strip Khrushchev of his power, citing his chaotic decision-making. To replace him, they elevated Leonid Brezhnev, a leader chosen specifically for his predictable, cautious conservatism. Brezhnev instituted a core policy known as stability of cadres. This ended Khrushchev's disruptive term limits and guaranteed absolute job security for the ruling class, insulating them from purges and performance reviews. While they demanded stability at home, they maintained aggression abroad. When Czechoslovakia attempted democratic reforms during the Prague Spring, Warsaw-Pact tanks rolled in. This intervention was formalized as the Brezhnev Doctrine, declaring that any socialist gains in satellite states would be permanently enforced by Moscow and could never be reversed. The system locked into place. The dynamic energy of the early Soviet state gave way to total bureaucratic paralysis. By prioritizing their own comfort and absolute job security above all else, the Soviet elite stripped the state of any mechanism to innovate, adapt, or correct its own failures. This period became known as the era of stagnation. Guaranteed lifetime appointments mutated the leadership into a rigid, aging gerontocracy, operating entirely through patronage. Meanwhile, the domestic economy began rotting from the inside. Decades of forced collectivization and mismanagement left the agricultural sector unable to reliably feed the population. The vanguard of the global working class found itself in a humiliating position. They began importing millions of tons of basic grain from their capitalist rivals to prevent famine. The Soviet economy was saved from immediate collapse by a historical accident, the global oil price shocks of the 1970s. The discovery of massive Siberian energy reserves brought a sudden, enormous influx of cash. This chart shows the Soviet economic shift. Domestic industrial output flatlined, while fossil fuel export revenues skyrocketed. Instead of fixing the broken system, this new wealth was siphoned into two streams: massive military expenditures and foreign grain to keep the population fed. The state had effectively devolved into a petrostate, surviving day to day by selling raw materials to hide the terminal decline of its command economy. The fragile illusion of invincibility cracked in 1979 when the Soviet army was sent into Afghanistan. What was intended to be a swift intervention turned into a decade-long, unwinnable quagmire. The conflict drained the state's remaining financial reserves and shattered whatever moral authority it still held with its own citizens. The structural foundations had been hollowed out for years. When the collapse finally came, it happened with terrifying speed. Until the end, the state staged spectacles of military might, marching tanks across Red Square to a cynical public that no longer believed the propaganda. In their desperate bid to escape Stalin's terror and Khrushchev's chaos, the Soviet elite built a highly comfortable, rigidly stable system. But by prioritizing their own survival over genuine reform, they secretly hollowed out the empire, guaranteeing its spectacular demise.
By the early 1980s, the Soviet Union had stood for nearly 7 decades. From the outside, the empire projected an image of absolute permanence, but beneath the surface, the state was buckling under its own massive weight. The Kremlin was managed by an aging old guard. Following the prolonged decline of Leonid Brezhnev, a succession of elderly, ailing leaders took power, only to die shortly after taking office. This gerontocracy left the government paralyzed, completely unable to address the mounting domestic crises or foster any kind of innovation. At the same time, the Soviet military was bogged down in Afghanistan. What was supposed to be a quick intervention had devolved into a protracted, unwinnable conflict, inflicting a severe financial toll on the state budget and a deep psychological toll on the public. Despite the decay, the system held together because it was rigidly engineered around three uncompromising pillars: a centrally planned command economy, strict ideological censorship, and unquestionable authority from Moscow. In 1985, the Politburo selected a new general secretary. At 54, Mikhail Gorbachev was young, energetic, and acutely aware of the structural rot. He genuinely believed the communist system could be saved and modernized. To fix the stagnation, he introduced his first major policy, perestroika, or restructuring. It was a calculated risk to inject limited market-based incentives and enterprise autonomy into a system that had been strictly micromanaged by the state. His second major policy was glasnost, meaning openness. Gorbachev lifted strict state censorship, hoping that if citizens could openly discuss the inefficiencies of the Soviet system, they could help the government find solutions. By loosening economic control and permitting public criticism, Gorbachev intended to strengthen the country. But instead, he had inadvertently attached explosives to the very pillars that kept the Soviet state from collapsing. In April 1986, the Chernobyl nuclear power plant suffered a catastrophic meltdown. The immediate instinct of the state apparatus was to do what it had always done: conceal the failure and cover it up from the public and the international community. But the radiation spread, making the disaster impossible to hide. The delayed and inadequate response shattered public trust in the government. For Gorbachev, the disaster proved that the old culture of secrecy was deadly, convincing him to vastly accelerate glasnost. Empowered by this new openness, the Soviet press bypassed discussions of current economic inefficiencies. Instead, newspapers and historians began exposing the deeply buried atrocities of the Stalin era, airing decades of historical trauma. Rather than generating calm, rational discussions on how to repair socialism, glasnost eradicated the population's fear. Generations of forced obedience rapidly transformed into unrestrained, highly vocal outrage directed squarely at the state. While the political sphere was boiling over, the economic sphere was breaking down. Perestroika dismantled the authority of Gazprom, the central state agency that had historically coordinated the entire supply chain of the Soviet economy. This created a fatal paradox. New laws gave factory managers the autonomy to decide what to produce and whom to trade with, but the state still rigidly dictated the prices of goods. This mismatch obliterated the supply chains. Enterprises chased profitable contracts while ignoring state orders, resulting in bare shelves, widespread consumer hoarding, and inflation rates that spiked to 20% annually. The unraveling quickly spread beyond Soviet borders. When mass protests erupted across Eastern Europe in 1989, Gorbachev refused to send in the Red Army to suppress the dissent. Without the threat of military intervention, communist regimes collapsed across the Eastern Bloc, culminating in the fall of the Berlin Wall. Watching the satellite states break free, internal Soviet republics seized the moment. Nationalist movements surged, most visibly in the Baltics, where millions of citizens formed massive human chains, stretching across Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania to demand their own independence. Perestroika had effectively bankrupted the state, while glasnost had emboldened the nations it had long held captive. Together, they triggered an unstoppable chain reaction that fractured the Union. By August 1991, panicked KGB officials and Communist Party hardliners decided the only way to save the empire was to seize control. They launched a sudden coup, placing Gorbachev under house arrest at his vacation home, and deploying the military to the streets of Moscow. But the plotters miscalculated the effects of the past 6 years. Moscow citizens did not retreat in fear. Instead, they mounted a massive display of defiance, physically blocking the roads and barricading the streets to stop the tanks. Boris Yeltsin, the newly elected president of the Russian Republic, positioned himself as the face of the resistance. he stood before the crowds, directly challenging the authority of the old Soviet Guard. The standoff lasted just 3 days. The turning point arrived when the military commanders, looking out at thousands of their own citizens, ultimately refused orders to open fire. With the military's refusal, the Communist Party lost its absolute monopoly on violence. The failure of the coup broke the final pillar of state power, permanently transferring authority away from the central government and into the hands of Yeltsin and the individual republics. Gorbachev returned to Moscow, but the state he governed no longer existed in practice. Throughout the fall, republic after republic declared independence, leaving him a president without a country. On December 8th, the leaders of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus signed the Belavezha Accords. Weeks later, on December 25, 1991, Mikhail Gorbachev resigned. The Soviet flag was lowered over the Kremlin for the last time, legally dissolving the USSR into 15 independent states. This stark line graph maps the economic output of the post-Soviet states in the early 1990s. It shows a catastrophic 40% contraction in GDP, the result of shock therapy and an overnight transition to capitalism. This immediately stripped away all state-provided social safety nets. During this chaotic transition, the free market was exploited by former party insiders. These elites looted state assets to become powerful oligarchs, while the collapse of the industrial base plunged millions of ordinary citizens into deep poverty. Gorbachev's reforms were designed to modernize and preserve the state, yet the outcome proved a tragic irony. Because the Soviet experiment required absolute control to function, it was entirely unreformable. Any attempt at a controlled demolition was always going to be fatal.